Hello everyone, you're watching Let's Talk About Prepping. I'm Tyler, your host, and in this video we're going to continue our reading of the book Lucifer's Hammer by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell. This is a really good book about a comet striking Earth and the aftermath that the survivors have to deal with. I highly suggest that you get a copy of this for yourself so you can read along and so that you have it for yourself to read later. Anyways, today we're continuing in Chapter 1, Subchapter, January, Interlude. Be the first in your block to help blow out the electric power network of the Northeast. East Village Ether is proud to announce the first annual blackout of the werewolves, which is fixed for 3 p.m. on Wednesday, August 19th, 1970. Once more, let me put the system to the test. Switch on all the electric equipment you can lay hands on. Help the companies producing and distributing electric power to improve their balance sheets by consuming as much as you can, and even then, find some way of using a bit more. In particular, switch on electric heaters, toasters, air conditioning, and any other apparatus with a high consumption. Refrigerators turned up to the maximum with their doors left open can cool down a large apartment in an amusing way. After an afternoon's consumption spree, we will meet in Central Park to bay at the moon. Tune in, plug in, blow out. Hospitals and other emergency services are hereby warned and invited to take necessary precautions. The East Village Ether, an underground paper. July 1970. On a clear day, the view stretched out forever. From his vantage point on the top floor of the San Joaquin nuclear project, Site Supervisor Barry Price had an excellent view of the vast lozenge-shaped saucer that had once been an inland sea and was now the center of California's agricultural industry. The San Joaquin Valley ran 200 miles to his north, 50 to the south. The uncompleted nuclear power complex stood on a low ridge 20 feet above the totally flat valley, the highest hill in sight. Even at this early hour, there was a bustle of industrial activity. His construction crews worked a full 3 shifts, through the night, on Saturdays and Sundays, and if Barry Price had had his way, they'd have worked Christmas and New Year's too. In their latest flurry of activity, they'd finished number 1 reactor and had a good start on number 2. Others had begun excavation for 3 and 4, and none of it did any good. Number 1 was finished, but the courts and lawyers wouldn't let him turn it on. His desk was buried in paper. His hair was cut very short, his mustache was neatly trimmed and thin as a razor's edge. He wore what his ex-wife had called his engineering uniform: khaki trousers, khaki shirt with epaulets, khaki bush jacket with more epaulets, pocket calculator swinging from his belt. When his hair was all brown, it had been a slide rule. Pencils in his breast pockets, notebook in its own pocket, sewed to the jacket. When forced to, as he increasingly was by court appearances, command performances before the mayor of Los Angeles and its commissioners of water and power, testimony before Congress and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the state legislature, he reluctantly put on a gray flannel suit and tie. But on his home turf, he gratefully changed back to field clothing, and he was damned if he'd dress up for visitors. His coffee cup was empty, dead empty, and there went his last excuse. He keyed the intercom. "Dolores, I'm ready for our visiting fireman." "Not here yet," she said. Reprieved, for a little while. He went back to his papers, hating what he was doing. As he worked, he muttered to himself, "I'm an engineer, damn it. If I'd wanted to spend all my time with legal briefs or sitting in a courtroom, I'd have been a lawyer. Or a mass murderer." Increasingly, he regretted taking the job. He was a power systems man, and a damned good one. He'd proved that by becoming Pennsylvania Edison's youngest plant supervisor and keeping the Milford nuclear plant operating with the highest efficiency factor and best safety record in the country. And he'd wanted this position, to be in charge of San Joaquin and get the plant online, 4,000 megawatts of clean electric power when the project was completed. But his job was to build, to operate, not to explain. He was at home with machinery, more than that, with construction people, power operators, linemen, and switchyard workers. His enthusiasm for nuclear power was infectious and spread through all those who worked for him. And so what? He thought sourly. Nowadays, he spent all his time on paperwork. Dolores came in with more urgent memos that had to be answered. Every one of them was a job for a public relations type, and every one of them came from people important enough to demand the time of the supervising engineer. He hefted the stack of memoranda and documents she dropped into his end basket. "Look at this crap," he said, "and every bit of it from politicians." She winked. "Illegitimi non carborundum," she said. Barry winked back. "It ain't easy. Dinner? Sure." He felt the anticipation from the bright promise in her quick smile. Barry Price sleeps with his secretary. I suppose, he thought, the department would get upset if they knew. And to hell with them. He felt the quiet. The building should be humming with the faint vibrations of turbines, the feel and sound of megawatts pouring into the grid, feeding Los Angeles and its industries. But there was nothing. Below him was the rectangular building that contained the turbines, beautiful machines, a paean to man's ingenuity, weighing hundreds of tons and balanced to micrograms, able to spin at fantastic speeds and not vibrate at all. Why couldn't people understand? Why didn't everyone appreciate the beauty of fine machinery, the magnificence? "Cheer up," Dolores said, reading his thoughts. "The crews are working. Maybe this time they'll let us finish." "Wouldn't that make the news?" Barry asked. "Actually, I'd rather it didn't. The less publicity we have, the better off we are. And that's crazy." Dolores nodded and went to the windows. She stared across the San Joaquin Valley toward the Temblor Range, 30 miles away. "Haze out there," she said. "One of these days." Yes, that was a cheerful thought. Southern California had to have power, and with natural gas shortages, the only ways were coal and nuclear. There was no way at all to burn coal and not get some haze and smog. "We've got the only clean way to go," Barry said, "and we've won every time the public got to vote." You'd think even lawyers and politicians would get the message. He knew he was preaching to the converted, but it helped to talk to someone, anyone, who would be sympathetic, who understood. A light went on at his desk, and Dolores flashed a parting smile before hastening out to greet the visiting delegation from the State Assembly. Barry prepared for another long day. Morning rush hour in Los Angeles. Streams of cars, all moving. Thin smell of smog and exhaust fumes despite last night's Santa Ana wind. Patches of morning mist from the coast dying as warmer winds from inland swept them away. There was this about morning rush hour. The freeways were jammed, but not necessarily with idiots. Most drove the same route at the same time every morning. They knew the ropes. You could see it at the off-ramps where nobody had to swerve across lanes, and at the on-ramps where the cars seemed to take turns. Eileen had noticed it more than once. Despite the stand-up comics who had made California drivers the joke of the world, they were much better on freeways than any people she had seen anywhere else, which means that she could drive with half her attention. She knew the ropes, too. Her routine seldom varied now. 5 minutes to finish a last cup of coffee before she got to the freeway, stow the cup in a little rack she'd got from J. Sue Whitney, and use the hairbrush for another 5 minutes. By then she was awake enough to do some real work. It would take another half hour to get to Corrigan's Plumbing Supplies in Burbank, and she could get a lot done with the dictaphone in that time. It improved her driving, too. Without the dictaphone, she would be tense and nervous, pounding the dash in helpless frustration at every minor traffic jam. "Tuesday, get on Corrigan's back about the water filters," her voice said back to her. "We've had 2 customers install the damn things without knowing there were parts missing." Eileen nodded. She'd taken care of that already and smoothed out the rage of a guy who'd looked like a barge tender and turned out to be related to one of the biggest developers in the valley. It just went to show you could never kiss off a deal just because it looked like a one-item sale. She hit the rewind, then recorded, "Thursday, have the warehouse people check every one of those filters in stock. Look for missing lead nuts and send a letter to the manufacturer." She returned to playback. Eileen Susan Hancock was 34 years old. She was on the thin side of very pretty, and the reason showed in her hands, which were always in motion, and in her smile, which was nice, but which flashed always too suddenly, as if she turned on a light bulb, and in her walk. She had a tendency to leave people behind. Somebody had once told her that was symbolic. she left people behind both physically and emotionally. He hadn't said intellectually, and if he had, she wouldn't have believed him, but it was largely true. She'd been determined to be something more than a secretary long before there was anything like a women's rights movement, and she'd managed that despite the responsibilities of a younger brother to raise. If she ever talked about it, she laughed at how trite the situation was. Older sister puts younger brother through college but can't go herself, helps younger brother get married but never marries herself, and none of it was really true. She'd hated college. Maybe, she sometimes thought, but never said to anyone, a very good college, a place where they make you think, maybe that would have worked out. But to sit in a classroom while a time server lectured from a book that she'd already read to teach her nothing she didn't already know, it had been sheer hell, and when she dropped out, the reasons weren't financial. And as to marriage, there wasn't anybody she could live with. She tried that once with a police lieutenant, and watched how nervous he was to have her living there without benefit of City Hall license. And what had been a good relationship came apart inside a month. There had been another man, but he had a wife he wasn't going to leave, and a third, who'd gone east for a 3-month assignment that hadn't ended after 4 years. And I'm doing all right, she told herself when she thought about such things. Men called her hyperthyroid, or the nervous type, depending on education and vocabulary, and most didn't try to keep up with her. She had an acid wit, which she used too much. She hated dull talk. She talked much too fast, otherwise her voice was pleasant with a touch of throatiness derived from too many cigarettes. She'd been driving this route for 8 years. She took the curve of the 4-level interchange without noticing, but once, years before, she had swept her car down that curve, then pulled off at the next ramp and parked her car, and strolled back to stare at that maze of concrete spaghetti. She'd been laughing at her own picture of herself as a gawking tourist, but she'd stared anyway. Wednesday, the recorder told her, Robin's going to come through on the marina deal. If he does, I stand to be assistant general manager. If he doesn't, no chance. Problem, Eileen's ears and throat were red in advance, and her hands shifted too often on the steering wheel. But she heard it through. Her Wednesday voice said, He wants to sleep with me. It's clear it wasn't just repartee and games. If I cool him, do I blow the sail? Do I go to the mat with him to clinch the deal? Or am I missing something good because of the implications? Shit, oh dear, Eileen said under her breath. She ran the tape back and recorded over that segment. I still haven't decided whether to accept Robin Justin's dinner invitation. Memo. I should keep this tape cleaner. If anyone ever stole the recorder, I wouldn't want to burn his ears off. Anyone remember Nixon? She switched the recorder off, hard. But she still had the problem, and she still felt burning resentment at living in a world where she had that kind of problem. She thought of how she'd worded the letter to the goddamn manufacturer who'd sent out the filters without checking to see that all the parts were enclosed, and that made her feel a little better. It was late evening in Siberia. Dr. Leonila Alexandrovna Malik was finished for the day. Her last patient had been a 4-year-old girl, child of one of the engineers at the Space Development Center here in the Soviet northern wastes. It was midwinter, and the wind blew cold from the north. There was snow piled outside the infirmary, and even inside she could feel the cold. Leonila hated it. She had been born in Leningrad, so she was no stranger to severe winters, but she kept hoping for a transfer to Baikonur, or even Kapustin Yar on the Black Sea. She resented being required to treat dependents, although of course there was little she could do about it. There weren't many with pediatric training up here. Still, it was a waste. She had also been trained as a cosmonaut, and she kept hoping she'd get an assignment in space. Perhaps soon. The Americans were said to be training women astronauts. If the Americans looked likely to send a woman into space, the Soviet Union would do it also, and quickly. The last Soviet experiment with a woman cosmonaut had been a disaster. Was it really her fault, Leonila wondered? She knew both Valentina Tereshkovna and the cosmonaut she'd married, and they never talked about why her spacecraft had tumbled, ruining the chance for the Soviet Union to make the first space docking in history. Of course, Valentina was much older, Leonila thought. That had been in primitive times. Things were different now. The cosmonauts had little to do anyway. Ground control made all the important decisions. A silly design philosophy, Leonela thought, and her cosmonaut colleagues, all male of course, shared this view, but not loudly. She put the last of her used instruments into the autoclave and packed her bag. Cosmonaut or not, she was also a physician, and she carried the tools of the trade most places she went, just in case she might be needed. She put on the fur cap and heavy leather coat, shuddering a little at the sound of the wind outside. A radio in the next office had a news program, and Leonela paused to listen when she heard a key word. Comet. A new comet. She wondered if there were plans to explore it. Then she sighed. If there was a space mission to study the comet, it wouldn't include her. She had no skills for that. Pilot, physician, life support systems engineer, those she could do, but not astronomy. That would be for Peter or Basil or Sergei. Too bad, really. But it was interesting. A new comet. On Earth there was a plague. 3 billion years after the planet's formation, there came a virulent mutation, a form of life that used sunlight directly. The more efficient energy source gave the green mutant a hyperactive, murderous vigor, and as it spread forth to conquer the world, it poured out a flood of oxygen to poison the air. Raw oxygen seared the tissues of Earth's dominant life and left it as fertilizer for the mutant. That was a time of disaster for the comet, too. The black giant crossed its path for the first time. Enormous heat had been trapped in the planet's formation. It would be pouring out to the stars for 1 billion years to come. A flood of infrared light boiled hydrogen and helium from the comet's tissues. Then the intruder passed, and calm returned. The comet cruised on through the cold black silence, a little lighter now, moving in a slightly changed orbit. Well, guys, I think that'll probably do it for today. In our next reading, we'll continue on with the next subchapter of Chapter 1. Anyways, I hope that was interesting. Hope you're all doing well, and I hope to see you next time on our next reading. Everybody, stay safe out there.